carbon copy of the Father. Thus, if we want to understand what the character of God is like, we simply need to look at Jesus, how he speaks, what he said, how he works, how he relates to us, to understand how the Father works. Which leads us to what we're going to learn from this fourth sign. We're going to begin it today. We're going to look at it over the next couple weeks. But here's what we're going to learn. We're going to learn a rule. And it's a rule we're going to call it the first response rule. And it's a hard rule. But what it is when we face crisis, when we face impossible situations, we should say, time out, first response rule is seek the Lord as our first solution, not the world. So let's jump in, chapter 6, verse 1. Sometime after this. And so after what? It's after that third sign. Oh, look at this. We have notes. Look at this. So, you guys are the best. Look at all these fancy pictures. Oh, man. Jaden, you rock. Thanks, man. There's that picture. There's the arrow. Look at that. Oh, look at these beautiful verses. There's the first blank. Wow. Seek the Lord. Okay, sometime after this. It's after this. This is after the third sign when the paralyzed man was healed on the Sabbath. It just says sometime. We don't exactly know how long it's been, but we do know that Jesus was at one of the three main festivals, and we've talked about this. This is so important in understanding the New Testament, that in the three main festivals, the Jews would gather from all over the Roman Empire, wherever they were, they would come to Jerusalem for those high festivals, the three of them. And we talked about how Jerusalem, the population would swell by 2 million people. Well, this is after that. He's left Jerusalem. He's made his way back up to Galilee, and we don't know exactly how long it's been. It's just after this. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far side, or to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee. That is the Sea of Tiberias. You know, it's funny. That's a not so subtle reminder that they're an occupied nation. Because the Romans were renaming the topography of Israel. The Jews called it the Sea of Galilee. The Romans renamed it Tiberias after one of their emperors. You know, it'd be like, hey, we're gonna rename Black Canyon of the Gunnison. We're gonna name it, Putinville. I mean, it would be like that. But you can see here, Jesus' ministry, his headquarters, we know especially from the other Gospels, his headquarters was in Capernaum. And this is just saying he went across the Sea of Galilee to the east side, to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. I always love the archaeology. If you've been to Israel, you've likely seen this. Back in 1986, there was a severe drought, and these two brothers saw the shape of a boat in the mud, and they went and dug it up. This is a first century fishing boat that they found around the Sea of Galilee. You look at this. This isn't likely. This isn't the boat, unless God preserved it. That's possible, I'm sure. But this is likely a boat that was in Capernaum. That's where they found it. Where Jesus taught, this would have been what the boat that they traveled around the Sea of Galilee looked like. And so they got in a boat, and the 12 of them plus Jesus, and they got there, and they went across from Capernaum over to Bethsaida. And you can see that there. Verse 2. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. It's interesting. This is the only miracle outside of the cross and resurrection that appears in all four Gospels. Four Gospels, there are four biographies on Jesus' life. Each one comes from a different perspective. But this is the one miracle outside of the resurrection that's found in all four Gospels, which means we should probably pay attention to this one. This is important. We learn from Matthew, we learn this, is that when Jesus heard what had happened, and so Jesus sends out the disciples 2 by 2, and they're healing the sick, and they're declaring the kingdom, and all these amazing miracles happen. They come back, and they're like pumped and say, Jesus, you wouldn't believe it. The demons even listened to us. They were obedient to us, and Jesus had given them the authority to do that. When Jesus had heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. So we learn from Matthew why they went across. It was to get away from the crowds. The idea he was seeking rest and quiet and refreshment, kind of celebrating what had happened when they were sent out. Well, hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. I love Scott Stapp. If you're from the 90s, you remember Creed. They're like the biggest band on earth for a while. Scott Stapp, he's a Christian, and he's had a rough life, but God has redeemed him. And he has a few solo albums that are very Christian albums. One of his songs is "Jesus Was a Rock Star." And I love that song. It's true. He was a first century rock star. And everybody's like, "Oh, there he goes." And you have to understand that Sea of Galilee, we call it a sea. It's a huge lake. You can see across it. And so they see Jesus and the disciples going across the lake, and you can imagine they're watching this going, "There he goes, let's go." And they follow him. So he's kind of getting away from the crowds, but they're following him. And so as Jesus' disciples, they go by sea, all the crowds, they go by land. But those are details from other gospels. Okay, they had a different purpose. It's important as you study through the Bible, especially in the Gospels. I kind of like to disconnect from those other Gospels and just focus on John. Like, why is John writing this? Why doesn't he give all those other details? Well, here's the thing. As you look at what's happening here, we'll discover as we go through this why John was focusing on certain things. As we look at the crowds, and there's this continuing theme of people seeking fireworks versus dynamite. Why were the crowds following Jesus? For the same reason we learned back with the second sign that John recorded. That was back in John 4. People seek, sorry, it's a typo there. People seek fireworks. That's what they seek. And this is such an important concept in everything we do as a church, and everything we do in our lives. And you'll hear this a ton. It's important. Fireworks are awe-inspiring. They wow us. They're beautiful. They're impressive. They're entertaining. They always gather a crowd. They produce useless waste. There's a lot done in the name of Jesus in our country. It's nothing but fireworks. And they draw a crowd. It's temporary. But dynamite, the reason we call it dynamite is Acts 1:8, dunamis. The Greek word dunamis, where we get the word dynamite. You will receive power, is what it says. We want dynamite. Dynamite is also awe-inspiring. It's not necessarily beautiful. It can move mountains in seconds. It's a tool, not a toy. It's a tool. It's relatively simple to see. Declares what is useless to get what is valuable. Lasting changes to the progress of Jesus is in his dynamite. That's how God works. But people, they seek fireworks. So that's the same dynamic going on here. These crowds are coming because they're seeking fireworks. Well, we'll talk about why here in a second. Verse 3. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. And this next sentence is really important. Look at this, because it provides all the context we need. Is that he goes up with his disciples on the mountainside. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Why is that so significant? That John mentions, he's the only one who mentions that the Passover was near. Number one, it provides a timestamp. So we know that this feeding of the 5,000 is what we know it as. This happened about a year before the cross. So this is just like a year and a few days before the cross. It's nearing the Passover season. We know the setting. If you've ever been to Israel in the spring, this is actually Bethsaida here. This is known for its beauty in the spring. So because it's Passover, we know it's spring. We can visualize when Jesus goes up and the crowds gather, it looks something like this. This is a beautiful wildflowers and grass everywhere. It's beautiful in the spring. So we can, as we put ourselves into this story and we think about the picture and the image, that's what it looked like. But most importantly, is we know where the 10,000 plus people came from. You said, I thought it was 5,000. Well, it's at least 10,000. We'll look at in a second how we know that. But there's a crowd of 10,000 plus people, which doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Because the Sea of Galilee is a bunch of fishing villages. Capernaum was bigger, had like 1,500 people. But most of these fishing villages had a few hundred people. So where do you get a crowd of 10,000 people? Well, John just told us. We know exactly where the crowd came from. It's near the Passover festival. This area, we talk about how Jews from all over the Mediterranean would come to Jerusalem for these high festivals. Well, the main highway between any of the people coming from the north, the main way they would get there, if they're not coming by sea, is they would take the main highway that went right along the Sea of Galilee, right through Capernaum. And what that means is, as they came through Capernaum, they saw what Jesus was doing, or they heard what Jesus was doing. So we know that the context here, where the 10,000 people came from, is they were coming by, they heard or saw Jesus, then they see Jesus moving over to the far side, and they're like, let's go. We're on our way to Jerusalem anyway. We can just go down the east side of the lake. So once again, a subtle eyewitness detail recorded in the Gospels matches the historical culture and circumstances known from extra-biblical records. Jesus is not a mythological figure. We can be confident that what we read in the Bible is actual history. This happened. If you're making this up, you're not going to get details like that. This is history, not mythology. Verse 5, when Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, and oh, there it is, sorry. When Jesus saw the great crowds coming towards him, and you can kind of see here, he goes by sea, he goes up on a hillside, and all of a sudden this crowd of 10,000 people are coming towards him. But I want you to notice this. Notice that John doesn't mention Jesus' teaching or healing. The other Gospels do. But again, each Gospel comes from a different perspective. So John, he doesn't mention the teaching or healing, the sick at the feeding of the 5,000. Those details come from the other Gospel accounts. Why did John skip these important details? It's because John had a different purpose in recording this sign, which was to focus on the lesson Jesus teaches his disciples, okay? So what's the lesson? The lesson is this. Hey, boys, first response rule. Look to me. That's the lesson. Seek me as your first solution, not your last solution, your first solution. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd, again, we'll find out in a moment, it's over 10,000 people, likely. When he saw the great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? He asked this only to test him. I'd underline that in my Bible. He said this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. It kind of reminds me of the first rule for trial lawyers is you never ask a question in court you don't already know the answer to. Jesus knew what he was going to do here. And I got to say, so many times when I've heard this passage taught, and they're talking about Philip, and Jesus asks this to Philip to test him, and they end up talking about, pastors will talk about how, well, Philip failed the test. And I'm like, I don't know if that's how God views tests. Like, pass, fail, when we're, as humans, I think we think of tests completely differently. Is that humans use tests to both assess and demonstrate proficiency and knowledge. Thus, for humans, tests are an evaluation tool. Instead, God uses tests as a tool to teach us and shape our hearts. Thus, for God, tests are the lesson. He uses tests to show us who He is, to reveal His provision. So as we talk about this, look at James 1. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith, there it is, that testing of your faith produces perseverance. And so when God tests your faith, it produces something. You learn, you grow, your heart is shaped. The testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. So the Lord allows us to be tested, not testing for proficiency or evaluation, but testing in order to teach us perseverance so that we can become fully mature followers of Jesus Christ. Tests aren't evaluation, they're a tool. So what is a test of our faith? When God tests our faith in order to teach us and shape our hearts, it involves things that we love. No, it doesn't. It involves trials. It means crisis. Are you going through a crisis right now? Kind of sense our country's going through a few crises right now, or crises. So the testing of your faith produces endurance. What's a test? Crisis. It's not pass-fail. It's a tool in His hand to teach us and shape our hearts. Pain. We love pain, don't we? No, we do everything we can to avoid pain. Loss. Have you lost somebody that you love? Why does God allow that? Well, Jesus came to stop it for eternity. Death is the result of sin. However, what God does is, Jesus came down on the cross to end death. But in the meantime, God uses death of loved ones to shape us and teach us. Difficulties, troubles, and impossible circumstances. Are you in an impossible circumstance right now? It's testing your faith? Well, James, we just read it. He said, consider it pure joy. That's backwards. I don't know if your faith has ever been tested. You've been in an impossible circumstance, but in those times when you watch and God shows up and He does His wonders, a year later you're looking back on that and saying, I'm so glad I went through that. That's what He's saying. Consider it pure joy when you face trials of different kinds. It kind of reminds me of this. Remember these signs? We looked at these back in the first few chapters of John. And these signs, they're pretty popular. I haven't seen many around here. I've seen shirts around here, mostly from other churches. Not to badmouth. Don't mishear me. It's just popular among Christians to say, you are enough. What a bunch of bull honky. I said bull honky in church. You are enough? No, you're not. These signs, you are enough. You got this. No, you don't. 2 Corinthians, not that we are competent in ourselves to claim anything for ourselves, but our competency comes from God. We looked back at this, and when we were looking at these signs, and we were back into chapter 2 of John, you are enough. No, you're not. He is enough. So when we depend upon Him. And so when Jesus asked Philip how to feed the crowd to test him, it was to reveal to Philip his utter inability to solve the situation by his own abilities. In other words, it was to force Philip to depend upon him. Do you understand this? The reason God allows us to go through crisis, loss, pain, suffering, being overlooked, being talked about behind our back. The reason God allows us to do that is to reveal that in our own ability, we can't do it. We are not enough, but He is. And because He allows us to do that, He's teaching us that first response rule. Seek Him as our first solution. Seek the Lord as your first solution. It reminds me of this, okay? This is a cowboy. And I'll just tell you right now that this cowboy, he is saddle breaking this horse. And saddle breaking a horse, I've actually been able to watch a cowboy do this. We have cowboys in this room. I'm sure you've done this. Where you take a wild, unbroken horse and make them rideable so that they become instantly obedient to the rider on their back. I want you to notice something about this picture. Look what the cowboy has done to this horse as a part of the process of saddle breaking him. See the rope? You see the rope there? He's tied away one of the horse's legs. You talk about a test for a horse. This isn't a pass-fail. The cowboy is using this test, taking away something he depends on, making this horse uncomfortable so that the horse learns to trust the cowboy. Very similar to how God works in our lives. You talk about a test for a horse. Just as a cowboy tests a horse in uncomfortable situations in the saddle breaking process, it's teaching that horse to trust and obey, God puts us in uncomfortable situations to teach us to trust and obey Him. That's why He allows us. He'll take stuff away. If you're a parent, have you ever taken away something from your child to teach them a lesson? God does the same thing, but we don't like that. We hate to be uncomfortable. But it's all a part of God teaching us that first response rule. Is seek the Lord, seek me, is what the Lord is saying. Seek me as your first solution, not as your last chance. So Jesus asked this question, where are we gonna get food to feed these people, Philip? Well, Philip answered him, it'd take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. This is overwhelming, impossible. I want you to notice something here. I was so convicted by this verse this week, personally. I was so convicted by this. You know why? It's because I studied this passage on Wednesday. Tuesday night, we had our board meeting. It's a great meeting. We have awesome elders. Don't mishear me on what I'm saying here. But I was convicted because it's like, man, you know where we start? You know where we start our board meetings with? Our finances. And I was just convicted by this. It's like our first thought is always finances, just like Philip. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't pay attention to finances. Of course we should. But here's the thing. I want you to notice this. Notice that Philip's response to Jesus' question about how to feed the crowd was no different than a non-Jesus follower would have answered. And that's convicting to me. It's convicting to me. I don't know what to do with that. I'm just convicted by it. The board right now is freaking out. Are we going to stop paying attention to finances? No, that's not what I'm saying. There's another principle in Scripture called stewardship. We are stewards of the finances of this church. And trust me, we have qualified, awesome elders who are great stewards of the resources of this church. because it's not our money, it's the Lord's. Okay? So don't mishear me with this. Okay? I don't want to have an email saying, Brian, okay, whatever. It's just like the world, his first response was to look to finances. Money makes the world go round. Money is the root of much evil. Man, it's like, man, Lord, what do we do with that? Are we making decisions on what we do in ministry based upon finances? Okay, that's important stewardship, but how about we come before the Lord and ask him what to do? That's the first response world. That's the first response rule, is our first response isn't to go to finances. Our first response is to go to the Lord as our first solution. Back in 2020, in the midst of COVID, when I was a pastor at my church in Oregon, and we had, most organizations had to deal with the payroll guarantee program the government was offering. Remember this? And what it was that, with the COVID and shutting everything down for 2 weeks. Yeah, right. They were like, oh, well, what will happen is if you don't fire people from your staff, and we had a fairly large staff at my church in Oregon, and if you don't you don't fire people, but you just go through this, we'll guarantee money to pay for your salaries, and then after a year, those loans become forgivable. They're forgiven. So I'm like, free money, right? I'm like, sweet. And so we're at my board. We're sitting around there and we're just talking, and we're like, yeah, free money. Let's do it. Free money. And then flipping Hirsch opens his mouth. If you don't know Hirsch, you don't know Hirsch. Hirsch is an older guy, godly man. Love Hirsch, former cop, okay? Salt of the earth guy. He goes, hey, can I push back a little bit? I'm like, yeah, sure. What, Hirsch? He goes, I've worked for the government. There's nothing ever given that doesn't have strings attached. I'm like, okay, go ahead. He goes, hey, also, Brian, we're going through Genesis right now, and this is the opposite of what you've been teaching lately. I'm like, what do you mean? He says, well, you just taught a couple weeks ago. We're going through Genesis and how Abraham rescued his nephew Lot when Lot was living in Sodom. And these kings came, they were attacking, and Abraham rescued them and defeated the invaders. And the king of Sodom, he came to Abraham, and this is what he said. This is what the king of Sodom said. The king of Sodom said to Abram, before his name was Abraham, he said, give me the people. So the king says, hey, let's have our people back, the Sodomites. Give me the people and keep the goods for yourselves. So they defeated these 4 kings. So you keep the goods. We'll just take our people. But Abram said to the king of Sodom, with raised hand I have sworn an oath to Yahweh. Again, when we see the word Lord capitalized in our Bible, it's the name Yahweh. I've sworn an oath to Yahweh, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or a strap of sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abraham rich. And Hirsch goes, do we want to say, as our church survives and thrives during the COVID era, that the reason we survived and thrived was because the government helped us out? Or do we want to be able to say, God showed up? Well, just like Philip, by the way, if churches accepted the payroll forgiveness, that's fine. We just decided not to. That's what the Lord just said to us. But just like Philip, too often our first response is to look to the world's solutions in difficult decisions and circumstances, rather than to look to the Lord, who stands ready to work, yet waiting for us to ask in faith. Yeah, I didn't bring Blinky today. I took a picture of him, or her. Blinky's a girl. So here's Blinky. And Blinky's been out here. If you haven't been here, Blinky's been out here the past few weeks and as an illustration. But Blinky's here, and there's Blinky, happy as a fish can be. But let's just say that Blinky faced an overwhelming crisis. Let's say that we forget to clean her tank, and all of a sudden it turns green. And it gets so bad that it becomes toxic for Blinky. Now, note, Blinky has no ability to fix this situation. Just like Philip had no ability to fix that situation. Yet, how foolish would it be for Blinky to only look to fish logic to fix it? That's what we do. Why do we respond just like the world? We're not the world. We're not. In our homes, not enough money at the end of the month? Why do we respond just like the world? Why? When we do that, we're like Blinky, acting like there's no humans taking care of her. When we do that, we act like it's up to us. It's not up to us. First response rule, seek the Lord. What would happen if you're facing a financial crisis as a couple? What would happen if you guys, oh, well, look at our checking, oh, what do we do? What would happen if the man stood up as the leader of the home and said, hey, baby, time out. Let's seek the Lord right now together. What would happen? What would happen? What would happen if you're arguing so much as a couple? And the world, man, irreconcilable differences. Let's just divorce. What would happen if when you're fighting and you're arguing, one of you just said, oh, time out. First response rule. Let's seek the Lord for a solution in our relationship. What would happen? Seek the Lord as your first solution. Another of the disciples, Andrew, that's Simon Peter's brother. So obviously, Jesus is asking Philip, but all the other disciples are listening in. So Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves. By the way, I'd write this in my Bible. It's important. Barley was like the bread of the poor. It was like unfit for human consumption. It's better for animals. So we know this boy was poor. So here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. The word for small fish there is asperia, which was, it's not like a fish, like a big fish. It's more like a little sardine. It was more, it's more like a garnish for the bread. It's not like, full-size fish. It's just tiny little salted things, right? So here's 5 barley loaves, small barley loaves, and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? Just a side note, this is another thing I'd write in my Bible is Andrew, Peter's brother. The few times he's mentioned in the Bible, every single time he's bringing somebody to Jesus. Every time. Okay, Andrew's a hero. That's why Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, their evangelism training is called Operation Andrew. Just bring people to Jesus. Time in. All right, that was time out. Time in. Now, note how significant the generosity of the boy who was likely poor, who still had to offer up what little he had and trust Jesus with it. Now, as we get into the heart of this sign, this miracle, I want you to remember, keep in mind what we learned from Hebrews chapter 1, that Jesus is the message. We've had neon signs over the last few weeks pointing to Jesus. Now, there's neon signs like, Jesus is the message. Listen. So here's message number 1 from this miracle. Excuse me. While God isn't limited by what we have, He often works through what we offer Him. Thus, the starting point, remember, it's our first solution. The starting point in seeking God as our first solution is to surrender all we have for Him to use. If you're facing crisis right now, whether it's loss, whether it's financial, at work, at school, wherever you are, and you're facing crisis, you don't know what to do? First step, surrender everything you have to the Lord. Boom. First step. Lord, I have no ability here, but everything I have, it's yours in this moment. Seek the Lord as your first solution. Jesus said, again, have the people sit down. Look at this. There was plenty of grass in that place. That's such a little phrase, but it's an eyewitness. That matches what we know. This is around the spring. This is around Passover. There would have been tons of grass. You go there to this area today. What do they have? Lots of grass. This is history, not mythology. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place. And they sat down. About 5,000 men. Circle that word, men. About 5,000 men were there. That doesn't even count the boy who offered up the food. He's a child. Doesn't count the women. Conservatively, if you add in the women and the children, it's at least 10,000 people, if not more. So we're talking 10,000 plus people at this point. You're feeding 10,000 people with 2 small fish and 5 small loaves. It was an impossible situation. But here's the second message that we learn from this sign. Remember, signs give message, they give information. Here's a second one. Is Jesus could have acted without any participation from the disciples or the boy's generosity, but he waited until this moment. In reality, God doesn't need us at all, but God often intentionally restrains his work until he first has our attention and we've offered all we have to him. Do you see that? Why isn't the Lord working in this health situation? Why? What is going on? A lot of times he waits because we're looking everywhere for the solution except to him. And he waits until that moment. He restrains his work until he has our full attention and we've offered all we have to him. Excuse me. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks. What was he giving thanks to the Father for? For the bread? Well, yeah, in a way. But he's not sitting there going, oh, God, we didn't have anything. Father, thank you. Thank you there's something to work with. That's not what he's thanking God for here. It's message number 3 of this. Jesus was not thanking his Father for the loaves, but rather for the heart of this young boy who entrusted what little he had to Jesus. Seeking the Lord as our first solution means giving him our heart. Lord, you have my heart. What's our heart? We talk about this all the time. It's Jack Sparrow's compass. Remember, it doesn't point north. It points to whatever he desires most, his will. That's your heart. So when you're sitting there and you surrendered everything to the Lord, you say, Lord, you have my heart. You have my desires. Whatever you have it. Your desires, I want to be my desires. You give your heart to the Lord, your will, your desires to Jesus as your first solution. Then Jesus took the loaves, he gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. Underline that. He did the same with the fish. Here's the fourth message of this sign. That the multiplication of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish to feed over 10,000 was done without great fanfare. With John not detailing where it occurred, most people likely ate without realizing a miracle was happening as Jesus simply broke and distributed the bread and fish, trusting the Lord means we may not always be aware of how he is working, but trusting in him as our first solution means trusting in faith that he is working. Have you noticed in all these miracles, in all these things we've been reading, and anytime you read through the gospel, God desires faith. Faith and trust. Even if it doesn't look like the Lord's working, we have faith that he is working. Why? Because he's going to work in the way that furthers his will, not our will. He's going to work in ways we don't even see. That first response rule, seek the Lord as your first solution. Verse 12, when they had enough to eat, this is another thing I'd write in my word. Enough to eat, the Greek word there is literally glutted, as in gluttony. When they had all been glutted, the idea is like after Thanksgiving dinner. It's like you're so full, you can't have another bite. They're glutted. When they'd all had been glutted, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted. This is a very impoverished culture. They don't want to waste what the Lord has provided. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets, not a coincidence. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 disciples. It's almost like there's a pattern. Filled them with 12 baskets, one for each of the disciples to carry, by the way. This lesson John's focusing on is about what the disciples learned. With the pieces of 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Is anybody else hungry? I'm hungry. Dee, we're going to celebrate your ministry and retirement here. So we're going to have potluck downstairs. But fortunately, there's a young boy. His name's Gary. Gary the drummer. Okay. He brought lunch. So with this lunch, 5 small loaves and some sardines. Okay. Now, if we tried really hard, we might be able to pass this around this room and maybe everybody gets like a little tiny bite. You can have the sardines. Those are gross. Right? But I was like, I want to really get an idea of the scope of this miracle. So I went to this website. There's a website that estimates crowds for you. And so I went there. I said, okay, so let's look at crowd sizes, okay? That's about 50 people. You can go on that website and say, here's a crowd of 50 people. Here's a crowd of 100, okay? You can see that. That looks like that. At this point, not enough food for everybody to grab a bite. Here's 150 people with a bunch of laptops. Okay, that's about 150. There's 500. Now imagine 5 loaves and a couple sardines to feed that many people. Now we're getting into the realm of complete impossibility. But that's just 500. Here's 1,000. You see, that's a big theater, 1,000 people. Here's 5,000. So that's just the dudes. You're in a major auditorium at this point. It's like a symphony hall. You usually seat between 3,000 and 5,000 people. But then when we get to 10,000, we need an arena. So that's about, you need an arena there for 10,000 people. They were fed from 5 loaves and a couple sardines. And not just like a little bite, like we do with communion, like a little bite. No. They were glutted. Not just glutted. There were 12 baskets left over so that each disciple had a basket to carry as a reminder of the lesson that they just learned. Message number 5 from this sign. When we face impossible circumstances, yet trust the Lord as our solution, He works in the power of abundance, providing more than enough. Maybe not what we think we need, but what God thinks we need. He provides more than enough. to meet the need because his capabilities and love are beyond what our finite minds can comprehend. That's why our first response rule. Now, I would love to hear a story this week where there's this family in the middle of a crisis and there's a teenage son who goes, time out, first response rule. Let's seek the Lord. Whoa. That'd be awesome. Okay? Probably won't happen, but that'd be great. There's another subtle message here, and it has to do with the boy. The last message of this that we're going to bring out today from this sign is that the boy generously gave 5 small loaves and 2 small fish. He ended up with more than he started with. It was enough for his own lunch, but he gave it to Jesus, who turned it into an all-you-can-eat buffet for everyone, including the boy. When we surrender what we have to the Lord, he promises to provide and does so in abundance. Yeah, I was thinking about this, and I'm thinking about that boy. I remember one time at my last church, we made a Lego pit in the youth or the kids area, like literally a pit full of Legos. The kids could climb in and make Legos. It was awesome. You know where we got the Legos from? We asked the kids to tithe 10% of their Legos. It's cool. And it created, it was awesome. I'd jump in there and play with Legos. It's great. And what's amazing about that is we're trying to teach the principle of tithing to the kids. That's what this kid just did. He didn't just give 10%, he gave his whole lunch. And we know he was poor. He entrusted it to Jesus. He actually entrusted it to Andrew to give to Jesus. And it just brings out that principle. Oh, finances. The world starts with finances. Might I just suggest, so does God. But the reverse. The world starts with, do we have enough? Do we have enough? But the Lord starts with finances as far as a basic Christianity 101 test. Remember, God doesn't test, pass, fail. God tests in order to teach us. He starts with finances with a basic test. It's tithing. Not pass, fail, but to teach us. Here's where tithing is an Old Testament principle. It's an Old Testament principle. Okay? We're not in the New Testament commanded to tithe. We're commanded to give, be generous, but the idea of 10% comes from the Old Testament. But look at this. This is from Malachi. He was the last prophet before God, before the intertestamental period. So Malachi, the Italian prophet, Malachi. Thank you for laughing. Appreciate that. Shelley, thank you. The people of Israel, they weren't tithing. They were keeping all they had to themselves. And through Malachi, God spoke to the people and he said, will a mere mortal rob God? Will a mere mortal rob God? Yet you rob me. Because you ask, how are we robbing you, God? In tithes and offerings. It means in giving me 10%, that's what I asked you to do. And then offerings above that. You're robbing me. You are under a curse and your whole nation because you are robbing me. Bring the whole tithe into your storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. Test me. There's another test. Well, he's saying, test me in this. Remember how God views tests to teach us? Not as pass fail. It's like, test me in this, says Yahweh Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to store it. Another one, here's 2 Corinthians 9. This is from New Testament. Remember this, talking about giving. Whoever sows sparingly, so if you just scatter a few seeds, you will reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously, so if you use a bunch of seed, you will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, As a couple, what are you going to decide in your heart to give? If you're single, what are you going to decide in your heart to give? If you're a teenager, what are you going to decide to give in your heart? Start when you're a teenager. Why? Because it's a test to teach you his faithfulness. Not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly so that in all things, at all times, having all you need, you will abound in every good work. And then back to Leviticus. This is what the principle we call the first fruits. It's all over the Old Testament. I just chose Leviticus 23. It says, the Lord said to Moses, speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to a priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. First thing you do before you spend anything else. You know how easy that is for us? Why? Because as soon as the money enters our account, most of us are paid by, it goes into our account first. Before you do anything else, I just go online and give first. Before you go shopping for food. Before you pay your mortgage. God says, test me in this. And I bring this up because of this. All of this to say, this isn't the message on tithing. Okay? If you're not tithing, you're missing out on the test. Again, it's not pass-fail. God uses tests to teach us and shape our hearts. So all that talk about tithing, all those verses about tithing, it's all about this. If you fell asleep, wake back up for this right here. Living the first response rule of seeking the Lord as our first solution is most practically seen in our finances. The principle of first fruits in tithing means we give the first 10% of our income before we spend anything else. This test from God teaches us to seek the Lord to provide for us on a consistent basis. You're always short. You don't have enough money at the end of each month. Constantly living paycheck to paycheck. In debt up to your eyeballs in credit cards. Are you tithing? Start there. Start there. See what God does. He says, test me in this. Do we believe this stuff or not? The first response rule. Seek the Lord as your first solution. And quickly, I know we're late. Verse 14. We'll spend more time on 14, 15 next week. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they're looking for fireworks, not dynamite. They just saw some fireworks. They thought it was fireworks. It was dunamis, that dynamite power of God. After people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet. The prophet was predicted by Moses. Daniel called him the Messiah, the anointed one. Surely this is the Messiah. This is the prophet who has come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. And we'll talk all about this next week. We're going to spend the rest of this chapter going through what happens. But here's all you need to know right now. This is all you need to know right now. And if you sleep in next week and skip church, just know this. Okay? John's presentation of this miracle doesn't end here in verse 15, where they attempt to make Jesus king of Israel. Rather, the fourth sign that we've been looking at continues through the end of chapter 6, when the same crowd who attempted to make him king by force abandoned him. It's supposed to be abandoned. I don't know where the S came from. Or they could be abandoned. They abandoned him completely when he declares he is the bread of life. After this sign, only a few true disciples will remain his followers, because they were coming to see fireworks, and what they got was dynamite, and they didn't like it. They abandoned him. So as the band, Tom and the band, come on up here, My question is, it's obvious. Are you facing an impossible circumstance right now? Are you in crisis? Maybe it's been a crisis been going on for decades in your marriage. Maybe it's time to seek the first solution. What if you got together and just started praying together as a couple? Lord, we don't get along. We're fighting all the time. Lord, would you save us? We're looking to you. We're offering all we have to you. Lord, save us. You're in a crisis about your future. You don't know what to do. Lord, I give my future to you. Work, school, at church. It's a crisis at church. We have crises at church all the time. Let's start looking to the Lord first, not to the bottom line. Our country, we are in crisis as a country. Let's look to the Lord. Lord, you are our solution. And Lord, I pray, I just know myself in the hearts of humans, we so naturally look everywhere else for a solution but to you. And Lord, I know that you stand there waiting for us to just turn and seek you, seek your heart, seek your will, seek your provision. Lord, we surrender it all to you. We ask you to show up in our lives with the power, that dunamis power, that dynamite power that blows up in our lives and we're never the same. Sounds awful, but you know what I mean, Lord. God, we look to you. It's in your name I pray, Jesus. Amen. Let's go ahead and stand up and let's worship the solution.